then you begin to think of all of the conditions that exist in these segregated neighborhoods that affect achievement. Lead poisoning, homelessness, economic insecurity. You can go into one after another of these many, many conditions. And after you've added them all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap.
Welcome to another episode of School 2.0, conversations about education and everything else. According to a 2020 USA Today article that I'll link below, American schools are still surprisingly racially segregated, especially given that we formally desegregated our schools decades ago. This article says that nearly 1/5 of public schools have almost no children of color, while another 1/5 have almost no white children. The article also talks about the very stark financial and resource disparities between schools that are majority black and schools that are majority white. This is a really big problem for education especially, and today I have on author Richard Rothstein. We're going to talk about his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Neither his book nor the first half of this podcast will mention education, so why am I having Richard Rothstein on to talk about educational issues? Well, Rothstein started as an education researcher and writer, and the more he found when researching racial disparities in schools, the more he realized that the real culprit seems to be housing policy. See, America has a lengthy history, which we will get into, of legal segregation, especially in terms of housing. Even areas that were becoming integrated found the governments intervening to segregate them. And while we've formally done away with those policies, though sometimes a lot more recently than we'd like to admit, we really haven't remedied them. So that's where you get some of the disparities and especially the segregation that we see in American schools today, even though our culture has formally left legal segregation behind. I really hope you enjoy this episode and learn as much as I did in my eye-opening conversation with Richard Rothstein. Richard Rothstein, how are you today?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for being with me.
Sure, yeah. I'm super excited to talk to you about your book, The Color of Law, and also how it sounds like your work in education sort of led you to this research. I feel like the best place for us to start would be to give a synopsis of your research and argument in The Color of Law, and then we can talk about how your background in education led you to it.
Sure. The theme of The Color of Law is that we have an unconstitutional system of residential segregation, that we have a national myth, a rationalization, that we have all adopted, and I mean all, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. And that myth is that the reason we're residentially segregated is because of private bigotry and private action. Private homeowners and landlords unwilling to sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or bigoted operators of private businesses like real estate agencies or banks or developers, or maybe because people like to live with each other of the same race. We just feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe because of income differences. African Americans have lower average incomes than whites, and so many can't afford to move to more highly resourced neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector activities and self-choices is what created residential segregation. We give a name to this explanation. The name is de facto segregation, a term we all use. De facto segregation is segregation that wasn't created by government. And we all think, and the Supreme Court has said, that if the government didn't create it, the government may not be permitted to fix it. And the theme of the book is that this is utter nonsense. The reason we have racial segregation in every metropolitan area of this country is because of racially explicit policies on the part of the federal, state, and local governments that were designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. Because of these racially explicit policies, they violated the Fifth Amendment when the federal government was doing it, violated the 14th Amendment when state and local governments were doing it. Because of this, our system of residential boundaries is as unconstitutional as the segregation that we addressed in the 20th century, whether of lunch counters or buses or legal segregation in schools. And because it's government created, not de facto, not spontaneous, not by accident, because it's government created and a constitutional violation. We have an obligation as American citizens to redress it, to fix it. That's what a civil rights violation imposes upon us. So that's the argument of the book.
One of the things that was really surprising to me, and I'm sure is surprising to a lot of people, that I got in your book, was that at some point it just wasn't the case that many areas were segregated. The areas were becoming more integrated, and you say it was government policies from there that often kind of nudged in the other direction towards segregation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In the early 20th century, we were a manufacturing economy. There was none of this internet stuff. Workers had to live near the factories where they worked. They didn't have automobiles to drive. Yeah. And factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts to ship their final products. So if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, the workforce had to live within walking distance or short streetcar distance from the factory district. And if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. I'm not saying that every other house was black and every other house was white, but broadly the same neighborhoods. The very first federal project, public housing project in this country, there was no civilian public housing in this country prior to the New Deal, prior to 1933, prior to Roosevelt taking office in the Depression. The very first public housing project that was built in 1933 was built in Atlanta, Georgia. It was in an integrated neighborhood near downtown Atlanta. Atlanta had segregated schools and segregated water fountains and segregated buses, but it had integrated neighborhoods for the reasons I just described. Yeah. The neighborhood called the Flats was the area where the very first civilian public housing project ever to be built in this country was built. It was built for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were demolished from this previously integrated area to find less adequate housing elsewhere, to double, triple up with relatives. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes wrote in his autobiography, The Big C, that he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. Not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. Not surprising. It was an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in that neighborhood, and with other projects elsewhere in Cleveland, reinforced that segregation. In The Color of Law, I like to speak of self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than North Carolina, for example. One of them I talk about is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Perhaps you've heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing there and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a policy and a pattern of segregation in the Boston metropolitan area that persists to this day. And let me say, every one of these actions was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation.
Yeah, and to be sure.
Yeah, go on.
And to be sure, some of these acts were in fact challenged in the courts, but maybe the courts, having the makeups they did at the time, they chose to uphold these ordinances, right?
Well, there were very few a challenge in the courts at the beginning. Later on, in the 1960s and 70s, some began to be challenged. But, there wasn't much of a well-funded civil rights movement with litigation capacity that could challenge them.
Right.
At the time. The NAACP at the time was really the only civil rights organization, major civil rights organization. Its lawyers got a grant in 1933 to challenge the segregation of schools And it embarked on a 20-year period that eventually led the program that eventually led to the Brown versus Board of Education decision.
Right.
But there's a nickel and dime organization. They had no
Yeah.
ability to handle housing at the same time as education, and they didn't. They weren't able to.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, I can imagine the conservative or let's just suppose conservative critic would say, well, these ordinances are no longer in place. I mean, some of them are pretty recent, but still they're no longer in place. So any inequalities that are persisting must not be because of those ordinances. But I think, your argument is that those ordinances really locked in certain features that just had their own inertia, it seems like. Once you establish residential segregation and especially kind of the financial inequalities that could come along with that, it's really hard spontaneously for the sort of integration to occur that would bring things to an equitable level. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to say this very briefly. I don't think I can. I'm going to have to take it if I may. The policies that were implemented in the 20th century were so powerful that they determined the segregation of today. And let me give you one example.
Yeah.
A very, very powerful policy. In the post-World War II period, the federal government, through the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, began a program to move the entire white working class population out of the urban areas where they were living. I described that before. Mm-hmm. Many of them integrated into single-family homes in all white suburbs. That was the federal government's program.
Yeah.
And with that program, they built suburbs. We were in the suburban country at the time. The only people living outside urban areas were wealthy people. But they built suburbs that created a white noose around every metropolitan area. These were all white suburbs. The most famous of these is probably Levittown, east of New York City. Mm-hmm. 17,000 homes in one place. The builder of Levittown, William Levitt, could never have gotten the capital to buy the land and build those homes on his own in the private sector. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do such a thing. 17,000 homes in a country that wasn't yet suburban. The banks didn't think anybody would want to buy these homes. Mm. The only way that Levitt could build this subdivision, and I'm not picking on Levitt, there were hundreds and hundreds of these projects in every metropolitan area in this country of suburban developments that were created during this great suburbanization period after World War II. The only way that Levitt and these other builders could get the capital was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, the construction materials they were going to use, the design of the streets, the architectural plans, and so forth, and a federally required commitment that they never sell a home to an African American.
Wow.
The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required that Levitt place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans and rental to African Americans.
Wow.
This was an unconstitutional policy. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working at the FHA or VA. It was written out in the federal policy manual of the FHA. It was the underwriting manual distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to developers to build these subdivisions. The federal manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a project that was going to be integrated, that was going to sell to African Americans. You couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a project that was going to be for whites only. If it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Well, with these federal bank guarantees, let me just, maybe I'll interrupt myself and say that in my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the Federal Housing Administration required a Detroit builder to construct before they would approve a loan to develop an all-white subdivision that was located near where African Americans were living, and that wall was to separate his project from a nearby African American neighborhood. Well, to get to the real point of your question, those homes sold at the time, they were very expensive for working class families. They sold for $8,000-9,000 a piece. In the mid-20th century, in today's money, inflation adjusted, that's about $100,000. The white families who bought those homes saw those homes appreciate in value over the next few generations. They no longer sell for $100,000. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000.
Yep.
In some parts of the country, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. That's how most families in this country gain wealth, if they have any, from the equity they have in their homes. The white families use that wealth to send their children to college. They use it to take care of perhaps medical or temporary unemployment emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, nationwide, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that, too. We don't have time to go into it. But you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, it'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But whereas there's a 60% income ratio, African American households have only 5% of the wealth of white households. Wow. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that we've never taken upon ourselves the obligation which we have to remedy it. Well, now let me get to the specific answer to your question. The Fair Housing Act prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. That policy that I described of the FHA and VA is no longer in force. African Americans can now get FHA or VA loans just as easily as whites can. And as a result of the Fair Housing Act, that community I talked about before, Levittown, has about a 2% African American population. There are African Americans who can afford to buy homes for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. But most African Americans cannot because of that wealth gap. They can't come up with a down payment for those homes, and their incomes are too low as a result of other policies of segregation, which I say we don't have time to go into, so that they can afford it. Well, Levittown is in a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So the difference between that 2% that the Fair Housing Act can take care of and the 15% that's largely a result of that wealth gap that was unconstitutionally created is the difference that can't be taken care of by the Fair Housing Act. And so to say that the Fair Housing Act can undo that policy of segregation is fallacious. It can't. The only way to undo that is to enact the reverse kind of policy from the one that we implemented. We need to subsidize African Americans to move into communities from which their families could have moved when they were created, but which were banned to them when they were affordable to African Americans and to whites who were working class or middle class. There's no way the private market can take care of that problem. It requires a federal policy, an affirmative action program in housing that's as aggressive as the federal policy that created the segregation in the first place.
Yeah, I also, kind of on a personal note, I also worry about what seems like almost probably a self-perpetuating cycle. Earlier, you mentioned that policy would often prohibit builders from building for racially disharmonious groups. And it just seems like that would be a self-perpetuating cycle. The less groups are integrated and the less groups experience each other closely on a regular basis, the less harmonious they would be, and it would just perpetuate. So, for instance, I have a 4.5-year-old son, and it really took him growing up for me to really notice that he wasn't getting a lot of racially diverse interaction, especially because the only people of a different race he was seeing were in very predictable places. And you start thinking about, well, is he going to get impressions about people of different racial backgrounds because they're kind of segregated over there? And it just seems like that it's a perpetuating cycle.
I agree with you completely. When we force, as we did, African Americans to live in overcrowded neighborhoods without adequate public services, without space for either residential space inside or space outside where their children can play, for example, where they're so overcrowded that all of their social life takes place on the streets, not in living rooms as it does in white communities with multiple bedrooms and other rooms in their homes. When we create that kind of situation, whites look at those neighborhoods and they see them as slums because of public policy, but they don't know that. They see them as slums. And they conclude that African Americans are naturally slum dwellers. And it reinforces whatever feelings of stereotype feelings they had previously.
Yeah.
So you're right. It's a circular process. It's the bigoted feelings, bigoted policies that create the segregation, and the segregation reinforces those attitudes.
Yeah. So listeners at this point probably are realizing that we haven't really brought up education at all, but hopefully astute listeners are realizing that this probably has a lot kind of to do with educational segregation as well. So one of the reasons I was so eager to talk to you on this podcast is because you have a background, or you've studied, education policy. And I'm pretty sure I heard in another interview somewhere, you mentioned that it was your research in education and presumably educational inequalities that led you to the research that we just talked about. So can you explain kind of how your work in education led you to this other research and now has pulled you into kind of housing policy?
Sure, and I apologize, but it's also not a short story, but
that's fine.
I'll make it as brief as I can.
That's fine.
As you may know or remember, depending on how old your listeners are, we had a policy, an educational policy in the 1990s and 2000s that said the reason we have an achievement gap in schools between black and white children is because teachers have low expectations of black children. They don't try very hard. And if we could force teachers to raise their expectations of black children and try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. We took that, I call it a ludicrous policy. I wrote many, many articles about it at the time. We took that policy and enacted into federal law the No Child Left Behind Act, whose theory was, in 2001, it was voted on and adopted and implemented in 2002. Its theory was that if we test children every year and hold teachers accountable for their test scores, the achievement gap will disappear. Well, as I say, it was ludicrous. The achievement gap didn't disappear. It didn't even narrow significantly based on a totally flawed idea. Of course, there are some bigoted teachers who have low expectations of black children. There's some like that, but that's not the reason we have an achievement gap. And so in my writings at the time, I was trying to explain why that law was foolish, why it would inevitably fail. The reason we have an achievement gap is not because teachers have low expectations, although some do. The reason we have an achievement gap is primarily because of the social and economic conditions that disadvantaged, low-income black children in particular come to school with that interferes with their ability to take advantage of what schools have to offer. So I remember, I was the education columnist at the New York Times. And I remember writing one column about asthma. African-American children, as you know, I think, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class white children. It's an astounding difference, 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more industrial plants nearby, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And I explained that if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma. It's not true of everyone, but more likely to be up at night wheezing and coming to school the next day sleepless or drowsy. And if you have two groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition of the group, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic situation, but one group has a higher rate of asthma, that group, for that reason alone, is going to have somewhat lower achievement because sleepy children don't learn as well-rested children. Well, it has a tiny impact. But then you begin to think of all of the conditions that exist in these segregated neighborhoods that affect achievement. Lead poisoning. Lead poisoning, as you know, has an effect, a measurable effect on IQ. And African Americans live in neighborhoods where they're more likely to be lead poisoned. Homelessness, economic insecurity. You can go into one after another of these many, many conditions. And after you've added them all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. Well, I realized in doing this research about each of these individual conditions that what happens when you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or some other challenge like that. How can such a school ever be expected, no matter how many laws we pass and no matter how often we test children, to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished, in economically secure homes and spacious enough places where they can do homework uninterrupted? How can you expect those schools ever to have a similar achievement? Well, you can't. I mean, you can write a law that says they will, but you can't. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children like that, we call them, as you know, segregated schools, and schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think of neighborhood segregation as a school problem, as an educational issue. I wasn't yet really focused on housing. And that's how I came to this topic. And then I had an experience which really led me on the path that I subsequently took. And that's in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that involved two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of these districts had a very, very token, trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend, but if that choice was going to further exacerbate segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would not do so. So if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and you had one place left and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, black child would be given some preference, help to minimize the segregation in the school. It was a trivial program. You don't have one place left very often, and both a black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court evaluated it, denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing. The controlling decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated de facto. All of those reasons I described before. He said, well, you have de facto segregation, segregation that the government hadn't created. The government is prohibited from doing anything about it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered, excuse me, I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville some years before that decision. There was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb, like one of the ones I described earlier, called Shively. The white homeowner had an African-American friend who was living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police did nothing to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police did nothing to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, agents of the state,
Yeah.
are and the courts and the prosecutors are enforcing racial boundaries in Louisville, I looked into it further. I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases, I'm not exaggerating when I use these numbers, of police protected, sometimes police organized and led, mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these was a constitutional violation, a 14th Amendment violation, when the police were involved. And then when I looked into it further, I discovered that there were many, many, and I've described some of them to you already, federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit, that were designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another. So that's how my interest in education took me to be a student of housing, and I haven't paid much attention to education since.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that your position would be something like, if we were to find ways to fix the problem of housing segregation, then we would have a really good shot at fixing the discrepancies we see in school? Because I hear a lot of people talk about school funding as if that's the issue. And that probably is a part of the issue, but it seems like the issue is further back than that. The issue is why districts have different amounts of money to spend in the first place. And that may be more because of the housing segregation.
Well, I think you're right. School funding inequalities are certainly important to address. But remember that, say, New York City, which spends $18,000 per pupil or thereabout, has an achievement gap that's not much different from districts around the country that spend $4,000 or $5,000 per pupil.
Right.
So equalizing school funding is not going to solve this problem. The only way we're going to solve this problem is by creating opportunities for African Americans to live in well-resourced neighborhoods, not just well-resourced schools, so that they don't come to school with those kinds of disadvantages that I described. Because if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or any of the other conditions described, a well-funded school is not going to eliminate those problems. It can address them better. I'm certainly not opposed to school finance equalization. It's a very important thing to do. To fix this problem, we need to do many, many different things. But the notion that the only reason we have an achievement gap is because schools in low-income neighborhoods are poorly funded is not the case. And as I gave that example in New York before, there are many schools that serve low-income children, if they're in cities that are wealthy, who get more money per pupil than schools that serve typical middle-class children around the country. And that hasn't shown to be a panacea.
Right. Okay, so I can hear a critic. I've heard conservative critics make a point like as follows when presented with something like your argument. Are you saying that black kids can only do well if they're surrounded by white kids in the same school? And of course, I think that's probably a deliberate oversimplification on their part. But what's the response to that? Because it sounds like that objection would be leveled at you in your argument.
Well, I may give an answer that surprises you. Yes. I think black children need to sit next to white children in order to do well, and I think white children need to sit next to black children in order to do well. We're a diverse society, and if people are going to be successful as adults in a diverse society, they need to have diverse experiences as children. So I think integrated education is an important reform in that respect. But black children sitting next to white children or white children sitting next to black children are not going to solve the problems of disparate rates of asthma, disparate rates of homelessness, disparate rates of lead poisoning, all the things I talked about before. Right. And that can only be addressed by desegregating neighborhoods and enabling African-American families to live in conditions that would have been affordable to them when they were unconstitutionally excluded from them, and which are now unaffordable without non-existent federal remedial action.
Right. So in some sense, it's almost integration of neighborhoods isn't simply about blacks, whites, and others being around each other. It's all of us having similar access to the same sorts of wealth conditions.
Absolutely. The same resources.
Right.
The same access to good jobs, access to transportation that gets you to good jobs, access to clean air.
Yeah.
Access to healthcare, good healthcare.
Yeah. I guess that's my response to that conservative critic would kind of take what you said and maybe go a little bit further and say, it's not just that white faces and black faces and Latino faces in the same classrooms will do something. It's that we all have access to the same sorts of opportunities because we're together. And I think that's what the conservative critic might miss about that. What about school choice? What are the prospects for allowing people, even in residentially segregated areas, to choose at least into theoretically integrated schools? Do you hold any real hope of promise for that sort of policy to do anything?
Well, this is a well-worn discussion, as you know. I don't think I'm going to say anything you haven't heard before.
Yeah.
But most, I don't know where you're broadcasting from, but I think it's probably a rural area or a semi-rural area.
Yeah, I'm suburban rural, and I should specify that I teach an intro to diversity class, and one of the things I tell my students, similar to kind of what we've already alluded to, is we live in an area that, like a lot of areas, you kind of know if someone says to you something about the black area of town, you know where that is. And if someone says something about the white area of town, you know where that is. And it's pretty safe to say that the black area of town would be less affluent than the white area of town. Like I tell my students, that can't be accidental. It just can't be an accident that it winds up that way. And that's why I really appreciate your book, is you do trace it back to kind of measurable policies that may have set that up. Anyway, that's just kind of my preface about where I'm broadcasting from.
Well, the reason I bring that up, and so let me conclude by talking about this. Most disadvantaged African-American children who are the subject of all this concern about the achievement gap live too far distant from highly resourced communities for school choice to offer them opportunities to go to schools that will be where they will be more successful. Having said that, there are a number of problems with school choice that I'm sure you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. When you provide choice, some parents will take advantage of it and others won't. And the ones who will take advantage of it will be the most highly motivated, ambitious parents, leaving behind even more concentrated poverty and disadvantage than they left. So school choice is a complicated issue which has both costs and benefits. Now, part of the discussion about school choice, and I don't know if this is what you're alluding to, is not just choice of public schools, right, but choice of charter schools. And charter schools, again, like the myths about the achievement gap, charter schools have not accomplished what they have promised. And a very simple reason why not. There are some charter schools which are terrific, and highly motivated, well-educated parents can choose those charter schools and know about them and send their children to them, and those children may do better than they would do otherwise. Some public schools are terrific. The quality of many public schools, and I've been in many of them in urban areas, are quite high. The reason, as I said earlier in this talk we've been having, that the lower achievement of their students is not because the school quality isn't good. It's because of the conditions in which they come to school with. And so the result is that when you look at the charter school versus regular public school sector, the achievement on average is about the same. There are some great public schools, some great charter schools. And the reason is not hard to understand if you think about it. The whole point of a charter school is to deregulate the school. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you have a charter school that where teachers don't have to be certified, where the principal can hire a teacher whom he thinks is inspired, and that teacher will do a great job. And that's true. But when you deregulate schools and say the teachers have to be certified, some principals will hire inspired teachers who will do a great job without being certified, and other principals will hire their nephews and nieces who are not qualified.
Right.
And that's the pattern in charter schools. There are some that exceed typical regular schools, and some that fall far below typical regular schools. So on average, the achievement in charter schools and regular schools is no different. But there's certainly some very good charter schools, as there are some very good regular schools.
Yeah. So let's just, if I can ask a concluding question, what are some ideas on how we remedy this residential and wealth inequality? You mentioned an affirmative action sort of program. Do you have any ideas on the most promising ways to implement something like that?
Well, you're asking me about my next book. But as we said, there's no political support for these remedies at this point. So we can have all the policy ideas we want, and there are many of them out there, and I'm going to be describing them in my next book. But until we have a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable to maintain these segregated patterns, we're not going to be able to accomplish what we need to accomplish. So I mentioned that affirmative action program. I'll just in conclusion mention a couple of others, but there are dozens and dozens of policies that are well known that we should be following. The Section 8 voucher program reinforces segregation because most landlords refuse to accept rentals from families with Section 8 vouchers. And so the only place they have to go is in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. The vouchers are also amounts are calculated on an area-wide average basis. And that means that the vouchers are too low, too little, to afford rentals in high opportunity places, and too high to afford rentals in segregated low-income places. And landlords in those segregated neighborhoods exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. So that program needs to be reformed, and the reforms are obvious. We should prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders, and we should adjust the amount of the vouchers so that they're higher for people who want to use them in higher opportunity communities. Same thing is true of the low-income housing tax credit program, the single biggest program we have for subsidizing the housing of low-income families. It's a Treasury Department program. The Treasury Department distributes tax credits to states, which then in turn distribute them to nonprofit developers to build low-income housing. The Treasury Department's regulations are backwards. The Treasury Department says that a priority should be placed on putting most of the low-income housing tax credit projects in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. That's utter nonsense. It's reverse of what we should be doing. It doesn't say it's for the purpose of creating segregation, but that's the effect of such a priority. We should be reversing that priority.
Yeah.
One of the biggest obstacles we have to solving this problem are zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of anything but anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes, and prohibit the construction of homes that would be more affordable if properly subsidized and allocated to townhouses, garden apartments, low-level apartment buildings of high quality. So those are the kinds of programs we should be implementing. I said there are many, many other ideas out there, policies that are discussed. We have no lack of policy ideas. What we lack is a new civil rights movement that will take upon itself the obligation to address this constitutional violation of segregation. And let me, if I can, conclude by saying that I am working with a group of national civil rights leaders who are attempting to create a new national committee to redress segregation in housing. It's called the National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation. Its point will be not to come up with policy ideas. As I said, we've got lots of them.
Right.
The purpose will be to create and support local civil rights groups that are going to take action to make it uncomfortable to maintain segregation. And if any of your listeners are interested in receiving the announcement of the launch of this committee, they should send an email to ncrrs@greenlining.org. ncrrs@greenlining.org, saying they want to be informed about the launch of the National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation. Give their name and email address and city and town where they live, and we'll put them on a list to be notified.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, Richard Rothstein, it's been great talking to you. It's been absolutely informative, and I hope you do inspire listeners to contact the organization.
Thank you very, very much.